There was a time when the gaming market was oversaturated with countless war-based first-person shooters. One in particular, Homefront, was created with the hope of saving one of the industry's biggest publishers. Instead, it managed to flop so badly that it put the developers out of business, toppled the entirety of THQ, and somehow still led to a sequel which also flopped. This is the story of how Homefront failed twice. To tell the story, we need to go back to Battlefield 1942, which was developed by Digital Illustration CE, or DICE, and released for PC on September 10th, 2002. The game was a first-person shooter that featured a bunch of vehicles to use in combat, huge open maps, 5 different classes, and massive multiplayer matches featuring up to 64 players. It was an extremely new and fresh take on the first-person shooter genre, which meant modders were all too eager to get their hands on it. This led to a bustling modding scene for the game, with hundreds or even thousands of mods being produced over time. The developers took note of this and facilitated the creation of these mods by releasing official tools for modders in 2002. One of the best mods for the game was the Desert Combat mod by Trauma Studios. It actually won awards and gained huge popularity, managing to reach over 1 million downloads, an impressive feat even today, let alone at a time when both modding and PC gaming were much less popular. So on September 1st, 2004, the developers of Battlefield, DICE, acquired Trauma Studios along with the rights to Desert Combat. $300,000 was paid up front, with an additional $200,000 to be paid to Trauma Studios in 2006. This is basically the dream outcome for most modders, who usually produce mods for virtually no profit whatsoever. It's also noting that at the time, it was much rarer for companies to bring modders onto the development team. Valve was one of the first companies to do this with Counter-Strike in 2000, which resulted in a monstrously successful title. So DICE acquiring Trauma Studios was pretty much the second ever high-profile case of this happening. Under DICE, Trauma Studios worked on Battlefield 2, contributing in all sorts of unspecified ways. But by January 26, 2005, Electronic Arts had acquired a 60% share of DICE. And if you know anything about EA, I'm sure this should raise some eyebrows. Unsurprisingly, in typical EA fashion, the deal between DICE and Trauma Studios was abruptly ended right after this acquisition for incredibly vague reasons. Even worse, DICE went back on their deal and decided that they wouldn't pay the additional $200,000 that they promised to Trauma Studios when they partnered in 2004. Needless to say, this was devastating news for Trauma Studios, which was now facing closure. However, things would quickly get better for the team, as on February 2nd, 2006, THQ hired them to form KAOS Studios. KAOS Studios was created in the hopes of breaking into the lucrative first-person shooter market. The studio's first game was called Frontline's Fuel of War, which was announced on April 19, 2006, with a release date of fall 2007. The game ended up being delayed, and the PS3 port had to be scrapped due to technical issues before eventually releasing on February 25, 2008. Unsurprisingly, because of KAOS's experience originating in the Battlefield universe, the game had a lot of similarities to Battlefield, sporting physics-based vehicles, huge open-world maps, and incredibly high player counts. In fact, Frontlines was the first game for consoles to sport 50-player online matches, which was only possible on PCs previously. While the game did try to innovate and introduce a bunch of unique mechanics, it couldn't really capture the same high-budget appeal of the already established FPS franchises. This led to an alright reception, with it sitting at a 75 on Metacritic today. This sentiment carried over into the sales as well, which barely broke 1 million, making both metrics good enough for KAOS and THQ to consider it a success, but not exactly a smash hit. It was at least a somewhat promising start for the studio. But, well, after Frontlines released, many left the company, including Frank Delis, the founder and beloved head of the company. With his departure, the studio's morale fell greatly before even starting work on their next title. It seemed as if they were destined to fail, at least until they had a new project on the radar. It's time to introduce Homefront, a revolutionary first-person shooter that was commissioned by THQ to save the company and make KAOS Studios into a prestigious AAA game developer. But before we could even talk about what Homefront was supposed to be, we need to talk about its disastrous development process and what was going on behind the scenes at THQ and KAOS around this time. The making of Homefront was not a pretty process, even in the early stages before the game was announced to the public. KAOS Studios' parent company, THQ, was in deep debt, which put immense pressure on the young studio to make a smash hit or die trying. It left the developers in a massive hole with few options available. Only time would tell if they could climb out of it or dig themselves even deeper. The developers being stuck in a massive hole is a terrible situation, but it's not as bad as the hole that you can easily fall into if people on the internet get your sensitive information and completely ruin your life. That's why I partnered with the sponsor of today's video, Delete Me, to help you guys get your information removed from data brokers' websites. Data brokers are companies that profit from selling your information, which is something that you should be really uncomfortable with. Being active online creates a constant threat of being doxxed, harassed, or stalked, and there's always the risk of identity theft and financial scams completely ruining your life. So Delete Me is a great solution to help protect yourself and to get this information removed from hundreds of data brokers' websites across the internet. I use this service as well, and when I ran my last privacy report, there were over 27 brokers selling my information online. Delete Me is now in the process of removing all of my personal information from these sites automatically, and I feel so much better knowing that I can actually take control of my online information. It is a great service, and you can get 20% off today by visiting my exclusive link in the description at joindeleteme.com/robocast and using code robocast for 20% off. So check out Delete Me, and let's get back to the video. After the release of their past title, KAOS Studios attracted industry veterans. This would usually be a complete positive, but due to the hobbyist origins of the studio, it led to the pre-existing leadership having less knowledge and experience than the newly hired developers. This could have been remedied if leadership had the foresight to step down, or at least listen to advice from the veteran devs, but for whatever reason, they didn't. It squandered the goodwill and morale of employees, and according to ex-staffers, wasted 2 whole years of development time on Homefront. Without a strong leader like Frank DeLise, morale rapidly fell among the staff. The first general manager lasted barely any time at the studio. The art and design department struggled to work together due to a combative art director who was hard to work with and had to also be fired halfway through development, and conditions were so dire that one employee seemed to quit every single week for the first 30 weeks of development. And it just got worse from there. The next general managers who came in to oversee development of Homefront were David Broadhurst and David Schulman, who were both despised by the entirety of the staff. Staff had this to say. Under them, it was a tyrannical dictatorship that no person should ever be subjected to. Schulman walked all over people to get to the top, and it wasn't a shock that the studio revolted against him once he got there. By the time they were finally given the boot, the damage was already done. The next manager they brought in was an improvement, but couldn't salvage the sinking ship either. And again, all of this was going on before Homefront was even revealed to the public. Not all of the leadership was bad, however. The executive vice president of global production and marketing at THQ, Danny Bilson, was one of the few occasional rays of hope for KAOS Studios and their aspiring first-person shooter. He checked in on the team about once a month to offer notes and check on progress, and believed the studio would ultimately save the entirety of THQ. His advice was almost always a hit, although one change he insisted on was quite polarizing. The original premise of Homefront's plot was what would happen if China managed to overtake the United States, which he impulsively changed from China to North Korea. A lot of the team believed that this was way too implausible to take seriously for a story in a video game, but had no choice in the matter. He also didn't have much sympathy for the long hours that employees had to work either, claiming that the studio's crunch periods were no worse than the industry standard, basically saying, it's okay, because other people do it too. He failed to address the fact that many were on call during holidays, preventing them from visiting family, or the fact that there were 6 continuous months where employees were working 14 to 16-hour days, 7 days a week. At most, he defended 10-hour workdays, which really downplayed the complaints. Those who refused to put up with these conditions and left the company were often not even credited for their work on the game, harming their future work prospects. The most damning example, according to former staff, was CJ Kirshner, who wrote the game's 2,000 plus lines of dialogue. The author that was credited allegedly didn't even write a single word. At most, ex-employees would find themselves in the special thanks section, although some, like Kirshner, didn't even receive that basic courtesy and were completely absent from the credits. In his stead was the game's creator, John Milius, who even got a heartfelt message for his writing and guidance and his endless fountain of creative ideas that helped shape Homefront in a way we couldn't have without him. Unfortunately, it is completely legal for companies to scrub employees' names from the credits, and it still frequently happens today. but this was not a good sign for how things were going for Homefront behind the scenes. And keep in mind, all of this chaos, no pun intended, happened before the game was even announced. As Homefront neared the end of development, THQ executives told the studio that, quote, their future would depend on Homefront sales and critical reception. And fortunately for the developers, dealing with the rough development cycle could pay off because Homefront was actually the most pre-ordered game in THQ's history, racking up over 200,000 of them. So that raises the question, how did Homefront turn out? The game finally released on March 15th, 2011. The single-player campaign revolved around a revolution against a North Korean-occupied United States, with mostly generic Call of Duty-like gameplay and little content. The multiplayer was similarly generic, but did innovate at least a little. It featured a mechanic where a currency could be earned in a match and spent on weapons, remote attacks, and vehicles. Apart from that, the game was painfully unremarkable and completely failed to innovate in an already tired genre. It managed to sell over 1 million copies a week after release, eventually settling at 2.6 million by June. Respectable figures, but not enough to save a sinking ship as large as THQ, especially not when the reviews were so mixed. The harshest critics, such as GameSpy's Rory Mannion, tore into the game for its formulaic mediocrity, giving it a 4 out of 10. A majority of the reviews had around a 7 out of 10, such as IGN's Colin Murady, who applauded the game's campaign for its unique setting, but admitted that the gameplay was unremarkable and far too short. These underwhelming reviews are likely why THQ's stock dipped 50% upon the game's release. It didn't help that they ran into a controversy over its advertising, as one of the ads was a YouTube banner resembling a news broadcast with the title, "Breaking News, North Korea Attacks." This image actually convinced some people that there was a threat of war, as this was a really badly timed ad. Just a year earlier, on March 10th, 2010, a South Korean submarine was sunk by a North Korean torpedo where 46 sailors lost their lives. Then, 7 months later, on November 23rd, there was an artillery exchange between North and South Korea, which resulted in more casualties and heightened tensions. This somehow didn't fly over the marketing team's heads either, as the game's trailer started with an explicit reference to the tragic sinking of the submarine. It was just cruel and kind of odd to reference such a recent real-world tragedy to promote their game. This controversy, as well as many other factors such as depicting a unified Korea, led to the game getting banned in South Korea. It also had to be censored for its Japanese release due to referencing real-world leaders and antagonizing real countries, which didn't really help the perception. So, since this game was all or nothing, and it ultimately was an underwhelming flop, on December 19th, 2012, THQ filed for bankruptcy, forcing the company to sell off all of its assets. And miraculously, or perhaps tragically, the Homefront franchise was picked up by Crytek UK. Maybe they would take the IP and create a sequel that could do what the original game was supposed to do. Crytek UK, formerly Free Radical Design, was a company known for developing the Timesplitter series and Crysis 2 and 3, all pretty well-regarded first-person shooters. This meant that the Homefront IP was actually in pretty good hands, all things considered, which was a sentiment cautiously shared by Rock Paper Shotgun. So, work had begun on Homefront 2, and it was all good. Sunshine and flowers, right? Well, this franchise must be cursed because in June of 2014, Kotaku reported on their parent company, Crytek, and its inability to pay employees on time for the past 3 months. This was corroborated by Glassdoor reviews, and in a follow-up piece, Kotaku found that 100 of Crytek UK's developers stopped showing up to work due to the missed paychecks. This included Homefront 2's director, Hasit Zala, and the lead engineer, Tiago Sousa. In the wake of this news, Crytek denied any financial troubles in the company, even though the writing was on the wall. A mere 5 days later, Crytek announced that it was selling the Homefront franchise to Deep Silver, who assigned their new Dam Buster studio to develop the game. Fortunately, despite the closure of their original studio, the staff from Crytek UK joined Dam Buster Studio to resume their work on Homefront 2, even including the game's former director, Hasit Zala. Unsurprisingly, the game had to be delayed to 2016 in the wake of all of this news. But there was hope that this new Homefront game would actually be something good. Homefront: The Revolution, a follow-up to the original Homefront flop, finally released on May 17, 2016. It shifted gears to open-world style gameplay and is a reimagining of the first game rather than a direct sequel. The most notable change to the premise is that North Korea managed to overtake the US because they bought all of their military equipment from the US, which they then hacked into before launching a huge invasion. As for the gameplay, the world was broken up into zones where both enemy aggression and your objectives would vary. Red zones were about guns blazing combat, while the yellow zones are a bit of a stealth mission attempting to rally the citizens into a revolution against the North Korean regime. A good idea in concept, but in practice, the objectives included exciting tasks such as turning on radios or giving homeless people money. Not exactly the kind of thing that comes to mind when you think of starting a revolution. And all of this was marred by technical issues, which Game Informer tore into. The gunplay is sluggish and inexact, making even perfect headshots unsatisfying. Navigation doesn't fare much better, vaulting over objects feels stilted and breaks your flow of movement. These basic problems feel like they belong to a bygone generation. The game had frame rate issues on top of all of this, drab, uninteresting environments, and many immersion-shattering glitches. Sometimes bugs would impact gameplay, such as enemies just spawning on top of you. The only element ever really complimented in reviews was borrowed from the Crysis series, the ability to modify your weapons on the fly. So it should come as no surprise that Homefront the Revolution was mostly met with 5s out of 10s and only managed to sell 1.2 million copies, grossing about 33 million euros as of February of 2018. Strangely, the game still received 3 major DLCs after its release. Overall, these 3 DLCs were alright and seemed to finish the story from the main game, but it almost seemed as if they were cut from the original game to rush it out the door, and so that the cut content could be released as paid DLC later. The only remarkable thing about Homefront the Revolution, in retrospect, is an Easter egg that was discovered on April 9th, 2021, after one of the developers hinted at its existence. In a Twitter thread, Matt Phillips revealed that the game contained a fully playable 4K port of Timesplitters 2, accessible from an arcade machine in the world. The issue was, he forgot the cheat code to access it, and the only place that it was written now belonged to a friend. Fortunately, this same friend saw the thread and shared the code, which also prompted data miners to find additional codes unlocking the full game. But unfortunately, this little Easter egg wasn't enough to save the sequel, and Homefront the Revolution also failed. KAOS Studios was initially a dream come true for Desert Storm's creators, but once the harsh realities of the games industry set in, their passionate spirits alone weren't enough to ship products under an ill-equipped publisher. While many had horrible experiences at the studio, things did improve for some after the fact. Frank DeLise, the founder of Trauma Studios, went to work at Nvidia and is a vice president for the Omniverse project. Other developers of the Desert Storm mod, such as Joe Halper and Brian Halinka, continue to work in the games industry to this day, while the others have seemingly vanished off the internet. Nordic Games bought THQ on April 22, 2013, following its bankruptcy. Eventually, they rebranded to THQ Nordic on August 16th of 2016, and in a weird twist of fate, ended up buying Koch Media on December 14th, 2008. This reunited THQ with the Homefront franchise, which they have yet to do anything with, and probably never will. And finally, Crytek UK's founders went back to their roots and re-established Free Radical Design in May of 2021 to return to the Timesplitters franchise. Unfortunately, they struggled to get the studio afloat again and had to close it on December 11th, 2023, before completing even a single project. Dambuster Studio is still around today and was the team that helped to close out Dead Island 2's development. And that, my friends, is what happened to Homefront. Do you remember this game? Did you play either of the releases? I remember seeing the cover at basically every GameStop ever, but I never actually got into it, so let me know your experience in the comments. Special thanks to Lee Alexander's KAOS Descends article for Game Developer, which was essential to the research of this video. Check it out in the description for a more in-depth look at the studio's dysfunction, along with all of the other sources as always. I hope you enjoyed. I will see you guys next time, and peace.